talking back with Mike Maat. He is the Libertarian candidate for the presidency, and he's been on my show before. He's an interesting fella, and I'm dying to hear what he has to say about why people should consider voting for the Libertarian candidate in these upcoming elections. Stay right where you are. All right, welcome back. And as promised, I have the Libertarian candidate for the presidency on the line, Mike Maat. I've had him as a guest before, and he always wants to talk about what he wants to talk about. He's a former police officer, and he loves talking about police reform. But, Mike, how do we not talk about a gold New Deal when the country is reeling with the notification that the Silicon Valley Bank not only mismanaged money, but that the government's going to have to bail them out, and they're saying it's not a bailout? Like, I thought you'd want to weigh in on that, don't you?
I do. I appreciate that. I was a financial economist for over 2 decades before becoming a police officer and spending so much time talking about criminal justice reform. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think it's terrible the way the government is handling this situation. I wish they were not bailing out the uninsured depositors at all. Right. I especially wish they weren't doing so and lying about the extent to which it's a bailout. It absolutely is. And of course, as you and your listeners know, Joyce, when we bail out institutions like this, it really sows the seeds of future bailouts. You know, people come to expect that their deposits are going to be bailed out, even though they're huge and uninsured, and that's what causes banks to take needless risks in the first place.
Right, and the libertarian policy, that the way that they would better handle our economic system is very interesting to me, because what it says is if you had instead of having discretionary policy, monetary policy, you would replace it with a constitutionally fixed rate of growth for the entire money supply, and that states would have a lot more control over what went on. Explain that to people, because obviously, a lot of my listeners are on Social Security, and that sounds scary to them.
I can appreciate that. With regard to Social Security, we wouldn't change anything for already retired, right? Regarding Social Security, we would give the youngsters a way to opt out of Social Security and create their own savings accounts and prepare for their retirement in a way that would be, more suitable for them. So we would create an option for them to get out of that system, which, as you know, is just merely a Ponzi scheme. With regard to monetary policy, you're absolutely right. I would get rid of the Federal Reserve System, lock, stock, and barrel in piecemeal fashion, starting with, as you put your finger on it, stopping this idea that they should have complete discretion over the creation of money and subject our monetary policy to a rules-based system. The rule that I like best is the Milton Friedman idea of having money stock increase by a fixed growth rate every year, so it would be predictable to the extent to which you would see any inflation or deflation. You would know that it was not because of the Federal Reserve screwing around with money supply. You would know it was because of something else going on in the economy. And of course, that pricing signal is very, very important. So this is a way that we would be able to address reducing inflation, keeping it under control, and taking it away from the Federal Reserve System. As you may know, the Fed's history of having so much discretion over monetary policy has been a big contributing factor to the boom-bust cycle itself. The reason that we thought we were giving discretion to the Fed many, many decades ago was to help address these boom-bust cycles, but it just turns out they can't do it. It's just too difficult. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, they have inadvertently contributed to several depression cycles, and we need to get out of that.
Mm-hmm. Now, you do see the 50 states as a sovereign in terms of some monetary policy, in terms of a lot of other policies. So, how would they opt in or opt out? How would this work?
The way that we like to approach it is, of course, to decentralize power as much as possible. You're right. We call the platform that we're running on the Gold New Deal because we believe we need a completely different relationship with our federal government than what we've had in the past. Mm-hmm. We would push as much power as possible down to the states. If it were up to me, I would create an option through a constitutional amendment that would allow states to opt out of federal supremacy, meaning to the extent to which there is conflict between state law and federal law, states would be able to resolve those conflicts themselves. They would be able to resolve those conflicts in state court instead of the federal Supreme Court. In effect, this would give them the option of nullifying federal law that was in conflict with state law and get themselves out from under a lot of bad federal regulation, a lot of bad federal agencies, a lot of court orders that don't make sense for a particular state. It would give each state an ability to follow its own political future and chart its own path. And we believe that that is the way that democracy should work. I think it's, much more in line with what the founders of the Constitution had in mind. Folks have teased me, Joyce, about, well, couldn't we just pass the 10th Amendment over again and say, this time we mean it? Yeah, of course we could do that, but we passed the 10th Amendment once that was supposed to make clear that states had the authority to chart their own futures. The federal government has walked all over that, so it's time to take the bull by the horns and give states more authority in a really explicit fashion.
So you would eliminate the IRS, I hope, because that's the one thing that I think I agree with every libertarian politician about, and instead have individual state governments give money to the federal government for, obviously, our national defense, period. There really may be roads, but
right.
That's it.
That's right. As a matter of fact, I see it as a two-step process. One is you do have to get rid of the IRS. I don't like the idea that there's a direct relationship between the federal government and individuals. It really ought to go through the state house to the extent to which the federal government needs money. As any of your listeners who have been audited by the IRS know, it's not a pleasant experience. I have been through it myself. Dealing with the IRS is problematic. Not only are the rules opaque and difficult to work with, but the IRS is one of the most powerful police organizations in the world. They have their own courts. You are literally guilty until you are presumed guilty until proven innocent in an IRS tax court. It's a really hellacious experience. And states are much better able to stand up to the federal government and represent us in a fashion that'll make sense not only in terms of collecting taxes and making the payments and following the rules, but also in terms of holding the government accountable, keeping the federal government from spending too much money. And, of course, the other part of the puzzle is just exactly that, holding the federal expenditure level down. We spend so much money. We don't have a way of holding the federal government accountable except through Congress, and that obviously has not worked well the last few decades.
Right.
We need a new approach. Yeah,
we do. And I think one of the other interesting platforms that you are running on is the fact that the idea that a government can declare war without the consent of the people being governed is insane to me. And that is exactly what we're seeing again. And then they do it in all these backhanded ways. Like, we'll just send weapons. And we all know you can't send weapons and not become a participant in any given war. And it's a lot of my money being sent to right now to the Ukraine. And, maybe it's just me, but I'm looking at news from around the globe and they're not winning. It doesn't matter how much money or weapons we send to the Ukraine. That's a lost cause. And yet my government seems compelled to keep it up.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And to be honest, even if it were not a lost cause, I don't agree that it's in the national interest to be sending so much money. By the way, we haven't just sent money. It is true that we have sent north of $110 billion worth of product over there in cash. But we also have, as many of your listeners know, at last count, nearly 1,000 troops, American troops, in Ukraine. They are hopefully not on the front line. They're there in training capacities. They're there as contractors. They're there to make sure that the people who are receiving the weapons receive the right ones and are trained on them. And I understand that. But to your point, this idea of the United States, again, being at war is absolutely intolerable from the standpoint of representing our basic ethics. I just feel like it's a violation of our dignity for the government to drag us into another war, completely in violation with how we as individuals feel. And make no mistake, to your point, Joyce, we are at war. This is no longer merely a proxy war. The President of the United States was over there personally. We have troops over there. We are manufacturing at this point weapons specifically for Ukraine. We're not just sending them, old Jeeps that are left over from the 1970s and sitting behind the warehouse. We're manufacturing stuff specifically for them. This is the same attitude that we would take if we were at war ourselves. And for this reason, I believe it's most accurately characterized as being exactly that. The United States is at war.
Yeah. And look, I'm less of a libertarian in that regard. I do think there are reasons to fight wars, but I just see this as one of these endless self-licking ice cream cones. At this point, the only people who are benefiting from it are the munition suppliers, and certainly not the people of the Ukraine who are continue to die in vile weapons, by vile weapons, some of whom probably got into the hands of the Russians because we left them in Afghanistan. But that's a whole nother story. And finally,
no, I agree with you. It's a terrible thing. But Joyce, whether you and I agree with every single military intervention that the government undertakes, I hope that most folks that are listening to our conversation would agree that we need to make it more difficult for the United States to go to war. As it stands now, the president can unilaterally make this decision. Congress rarely gets in the way.
Right.
Were it up to me, I would require a declaration of war, a formal declaration of war signed off on by the Congress every time the president wants to intervene militarily anywhere in the world. And I would go one step further. I would make that declaration subject to the approval of the states. I believe that, you are right. There are times when we need to defend our interests.
Right.
But I believe that we have been a little willy-nilly in how we make this decision. I think that we need to slow it down, make it more methodical, and make it more difficult. Obviously, we need to allow the commander-in-chief, in a case of emergency, to respond, at a moment's notice. But that is not the case in Ukraine, for example.
No, it hasn't been the case in a lot of the last 40 years. But if you want more information about Mike, go to Mike Termaat. It's MikeTermaat.com, MikeTermaat.com. He is the Libertarian candidate running for the presidency. Mike, always a pleasure. I will have you back, and we'll talk about police reform, and we'll talk about term limits, two other subjects where we have some agreement and some disagreement. Thanks for coming on today.
I appreciate that, Joyce. Thanks for your time.
All right. Thank you.